The 1990s had been a vital decade for Doctor Who. Starting the decade as a series on its final legs, the show had managed to reclaim an audience over the following 10 years, thanks to frequent injections of new talent in front and behind the camera. But now the 90s were coming to an end, and times were changing for Doctor Who, with the current production team and main star of the show on their way out. With the end of an era in sight, plans were put into motion to end the reign of the Ninth Doctor with a bang. Season 36 of Doctor Who would have starred Hugh Bonneville as the Ninth Doctor, along with Helen Baxendale as new companion Jean Robinson. It would also see Len Grant acting as producer, with Gary Russell as script editor. Season 36 would be Bonneville's fourth and final year as the Ninth Doctor. After deciding to stay on for one more year, and with the actor now in much demand, Bonneville announced that Season 36 would indeed be his final year on Doctor Who. This would also be the final year for Len Grant as producer and Gary Russell as script editor. Knowing that this was to be their last roll of the dice, the two wished to make this season event TV. Russell therefore devised an ongoing arc for the season involving the Doctor's new companion and the Web of Time. His idea was that the next companion was saved by the Doctor on the day she was meant to die, and because of his careless actions, the Web of Time would begin to crack and would continue to do so until history is corrected. For the new companion, Russell devised the character of Jean Robinson, a young woman from the early 1950s, with Helen Baxendale cast in the role. With both producer and script editor leaving, the BBC set about finding their replacements. However, with the slate being wiped clean, the BBC decided to modernise the showrunner approach by instead appointing a head writer who would act as the showrunner, something which wasn't too common in the UK at the time, but was practically the standard in the US. After some consideration, the job was given to writer Russell T Davies, who had been writing for Doctor Who since 1993 and had been mooting for the job of script editor for some time. Following his appointment, Gary Russell and Russell T Davies met for a brief discussion where it was agreed that Jean Robinson would continue into the new era, as Russell wanted a familiar face to help ease the transaction between eras. Season 36 would air between the 3rd of July 1999 and the 18th of September 1999. It would consist of 12 episodes across 7 stories, with 2 single-parters and 5 two-parters, and would go out weekly on Saturday night. The story would have been set in London in the year 1952 and would have focused around Jean Robinson, a young woman trying to survive everyday life. We see her dealing with her smug parents, as well as dealing with her job as a secretary to a creepy young CEO type. We then see her walking home alone on a cold winter night where the sky begins to fill with thick green smog. She begins to cough and splutter as the toxic gas fills her lungs. As she begins to fall to the ground, she sees a stranger in a Victorian get-up run towards her and put an oxygen mask over her head. The Doctor, before proceeding to pass out. We then cut to a POV shot from Jean's perspective as she wakes up in what appears to be some sort of alien science lab, the TARDIS. With Jean awake, the Doctor goes over to her and asks if she's alright. Jean says she's fine and that she's used to pollution, being from London and all. However, the Doctor says that this smog isn't right. It's way beyond human creation. It's alien. Initially, Jean believes the Doctor to be joking, but the Doctor is dead serious. She then leaves the TARDIS as she steps into the London streets, still filled with deadly green smog, which she discovers the TARDIS's bigger on the inside ability, which leaves her bewildered, but now believing the Doctor about his claims about aliens. The story then sees the Doctor working alongside Jean to try and track down the source of the smog, with the Doctor explaining that the Great London Smog of 1952 is a well-documented piece of history, further bewildering Jean, who hadn't considered the idea of time travel before. It turns out that the smog was created by a race known as the Vatrans, who plan to turn Earth into a new homeworld by polluting the Earth with a breathing gas known as lead-Z. However, the Doctor is able to foil the Vatrans' plans by releasing nanogenes into the atmosphere, which begins to clear away the lead-Z. The Doctor then forces the veterans to leave Earth by revealing himself to be a Time Lord and threatening to get the High Council involved. The story then ends with the Doctor and Jean reuniting outside the TARDIS, where the Doctor thanks Jean for her help. Jean then asks the Doctor that, since she doesn't want to risk dying again, if it's alright if she comes along with him for a while. The Doctor smiles and says he'd be delighted to have her on board. We see Jean entering the TARDIS, with the Doctor about to close the door behind him. But then he pauses, and moves his hand through the air, and breathes in through his nose. Something's not right. Something's changed, and yet he doesn't know what. Unsure and filled with unease, the Doctor slowly shuts the TARDIS door behind him. This story sees the Doctor taking Jean to the year 5 billion to witness the destruction of Earth from the safety of Platform 1. There they find themselves among a swarm of several alien life forms who have also come to witness Earth's destruction. We're introduced to several aliens with a connection to life on Earth, such as the representatives of the Forest of Cheam, life forms who evolved from wood. They also meet the last living human named Cassandra O'Brien, a paper-thin flap of skin in a frame which constantly needs moisturising, with nothing more than 2 eyes, a pair of lips, and a brain and a jar of liquid. The story would see the Doctor and Jean mingling with the other guests, as well as getting to know each other a bit better. However, the Doctor soon begins to uncover a plot to kill the guests on Platform 1, as he and one of the representatives of the Forest of Cheam, named Jabe, discover a swarm of robots have infiltrated the ship and killed the steward. They eventually discover that Cassandra is the saboteur. We learn that she plans to sabotage the station's shields and kill the guests on board when the sun expands and roasts the Earth. She meanwhile plans to teleport away to safety, and also reveals that she has shares in all of the aliens' rival companies, and that she'll receive insurance money as soon as they're reported dead. The story then sees the Doctor working with Jabe, as Jean is being locked in a viewing room, working against the clock to reboot the system and raise the shields. Eventually the Doctor is able to reach the reset switch, with Jabe burning and perishing in his efforts, and successfully re-raise the shields. He then teleports Cassandra back to Platform 1, where he allows Cassandra to dry and burn out until she bursts. This story sees the Doctor and Jean deciding to visit Venice in the far future as a break from danger. They arrive in the year 2294, where they discover that the people of Venice believe the city is expected to finally sink into the sea. We learn that some of the population see it as a natural disaster, whilst others believe it to be the result of a curse. Learning more about this supposed curse, we learn from the people of Venice that it was supposedly made 100 years ago by a woman named Estella, the wife of an aristocrat named Orsino. Estella drowned, however before she died, she cursed Orsino with immortality and cursed the city of Venice to sink. The story then sees Jean being kidnapped by a group of gondoliers, who are mutant people who have adapted to live in the water. She's then forced to pretend to be a resurrected Estella, and trick Orsino into believing that she is Estella, so that his people could have Venice return to him. However, it's eventually discovered that Estella was in fact an alien from another world. It's also revealed that she didn't drown 100 years ago, but instead disappeared and continued to live under the name of Mrs. Lavish. Eventually, the real Estella reveals herself to Orsino, and we learn that the curse was a side effect of the technology of her people. The story then ends with Estella and Orsino sacrificing themselves, which reverses the curse and saves Venice. The story would have been set in a fictional US state named Malbolgia in the year 2003. The story sees the Doctor and Jean separated from each other, with both of them dealing with memory loss. The Doctor finds himself in a psychiatric institute where he can't remember who he is and believes himself to be in hell. Jean meanwhile now finds herself being forced to work at the Hellfire Club, whilst also dealing with memory and identity loss. Meanwhile, we also see Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart serving as an undercover operative for the United Nations, while officially using his experience in devolution to advise the newly formed state of Malbolgia. However, he's secretly investigating the use of a medical device that's used to alter human minds. The story then sees Jean, who slowly starts to regain her memories, escaping the Hellfire Club with a woman named Becky Lee, to try and find the Doctor, as well as work out what exactly happened to her. The Doctor meanwhile meets another patient named Gideon Crane, who believes himself to be the Doctor. However, the real Doctor eventually determines that he is the real Doctor. He also discovers that Gideon isn't a future Doctor, but a journalist from the UK, whose mind was fused with the Doctor's by a machine designed to extract mental imprints, making him believe he is the Doctor. The story eventually sees the Doctor reuniting with Jean, as well as meeting Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart to stop the main villains of the story. The main villain would have been a religious evangelist and politician named Brigham Elijah Dashwood III, who's working with a demon-like creature known as Marchosis to empty the human race of their minds, providing ready-made vessels for the Psyvores, a race of energy creatures that feed off negative emotions and thoughts. However, the Psyvores are defeated when their machine is destroyed and the Doctor returns Marchosis to space. The story sees the Doctor and Jean arriving on an Earth-like planet named Waylock in the year 8651. The Doctor explains that, although they are very far into the future, technology has, so far, only evolved to the equivalent of Earth technology from the 1930s. However, upon further exploration, the Doctor sees that the planet's technology is way too advanced for this time period, comparing it to Earth's technology from the 2020s. We then see the Doctor and Jean trying to work out how and why the technology has progressed so quickly on Waylock. They quickly learn that this new technology was created by their great scientist on the planet, known simply as Professor Harrison. We learn that until about 5 years ago, Harrison was just another scientist, always trying to invent something brilliant, but always failing. And then one day, out of the blue, he began developing technology which was way more advanced than anything the people of Waylock had ever seen before. The story then sees the Doctor and Jean meeting with Harrison, where they get a chance to analyse his research and his technology up close. Harrison tells the Doctor that his next big breakthrough he is hoping will be the big one: time travel. The Doctor says that that's a pretty big leap to make, but Harrison claims he's already invented a prototype. He takes the Doctor to see his prototype, a great white cabinet-like structure, and stepping through the cabinet, it's revealed to be a TARDIS. At first, the Doctor is shocked by this revelation, and is fully expecting Harrison to turn around and reveal himself to be a Time Lord. Yet to his surprise, and after doing the blood test on Harrison, he finds that he is a native to this planet. Doing some digging into Harrison's paperwork, the Doctor learns that Harrison found the TARDIS buried in the ground, having seemingly crash-landed on this planet at some point in its history. The story then sees the Doctor trying to find a way to convince Harrison to abandon his pursuit in time travel and destroy the TARDIS, stating to Jean that the people of Waylock should not possess the means of time travel at any point in its history. However, he is unable to convince Harrison to give up his research, and seemingly accidentally goads him into pushing his experiments more and more. Harrison theorises that he could harvest and use the power of Waylock's core to jumpstart the TARDIS's heart. However, the Doctor realises that using Waylock's core is not powerful enough to restart the TARDIS and keep the planet alive, and doing so would destroy all life on the planet. The story then sees the Doctor and Jean trying to stop Harrison from harvesting the planet's energy. Eventually they succeed in their plans when the Doctor sabotages the drill's controls and sets the TARDIS into siege mode, resulting in the TARDIS shutting down permanently and shrinking down to a small cube with no doors or means of entry. The story then ends with the Doctor convincing Harrison to use his remaining technology to help the people of the planet thrive and survive, to which he agrees. The story sees the Doctor and Jean arriving in an Edwardian house in 1928 on Christmas Eve. They initially find the house to be empty and in darkness. However, as they investigate, they soon notice that they can't seem to interact with the house. Pulling a Christmas cracker results in time rewinding to a point before it was pulled, and nothing can be written in the dust on the table. They do discover that they can make some impact on the world by burning stuff in the fireplace, which causes the flames to move. Suddenly the clock turns to 10 o'clock and the chimes strike. The world shifts around them, and they find that they've been transported to exactly where they were, but different, as the house is now well lit and packed with servants. The two of them immediately find themselves wrapped in a murder mystery, with the staff seemingly believing the duo to be detectives from Scotland Yard, and the Doctor and Jean are forced to play detective. All they have to work with is Jean's weird connection to the first victim, the scullery maid named Edith Thompson, who seems to communicate with Jean from beyond the dead, telling her that there will be another murder soon, that the people of the house, as well as Jean, will soon forget her, and that Edward Grove is alive. Edith's warnings come true, as the cook, Mrs. Baddeley, is soon discovered dead. This leads the Doctor and Jean to discover that both Edith and Mrs. Baddeley were killed on the hour, leading them to theorise that another murder will be committed at 12 o'clock, midnight. However, when the Doctor attempts to summon the house as the clock approaches midnight, the staff refuse to play the Doctor's game and leave. The Doctor attempts to remind them of Edith's death, only for the staff to say that they've never heard of Edith before. The Doctor attempts to call everyone back as the clock handle races towards midnight. The chime strikes and then, unexpectedly, time reverts back to 10 PM, just after Edith died. With a new 2 hours to work with, as well as the knowledge that something unearthly is involved with these murders, the Doctor continues to hunt down the killer, leading him to discover that the killer is actually the house itself, Edward Grove, which has somehow become sentient. Realising the danger he and Jean risk of becoming caught in the time loop, the Doctor attempts to flee in the TARDIS. However, Edward Grove takes control over the TARDIS and traps him and Jean in the loop. Wishing to learn answers about Edward Grove, the Doctor makes communication with the house through a servant, who Edward Grove can easily possess. Jean meanwhile vanishes into thin air, and we see her talking to a spectre of Edith Thompson, who reveals herself to be Jean's family maid back in 1952. We learn that in 1952, Edith was working as a cook for the Robinson family. She was never thought of much by Jean's parents, and that she believed herself to be nothing after being told so by several other servants over the years. Jean, however, was different. She was the only person who was ever nice to her. We also discovered that the origin of the paradox, which created Edward Grove, originated from Edith herself. We learn that Edith was originally meant to commit suicide in 1952 after learning about Jean's death in a smog. But now Jean is alive, and Edith lacks no reason to do so, having met Jean in 1928. Realising the danger Jean is in, the Doctor is able to help the servant break free of Edward Grove's control over him, and orders the servant to strangle him to death in order to reach Jean in the place of the dead. Once there, he and Jean are able to convince Edith of her self-worth, which undoes the paradox that created Edward Grove, as she now never committed suicide. The story then ends on a somber note in the TARDIS, where the Doctor reveals the full truth to Jean after finally working out what's been wrong all this time. Jean is not meant to be alive. According to history, 12,000 people died in the Great Smog, and Jean Robinson was one of these people. But because the Doctor interfered, she's now alive when she should be dead. And now, her mere existence, a person who cheated death, is slowly tearing the universe apart. Jean says that she can remember dying in the smog, and yet she can remember everything she's done. She then asks the Doctor what can be done. He looks at Jean with a hint of dread in his eye and says that he really doesn't know. This story begins where the last one ended, with the TARDIS in flight and the Doctor and Jean discussing the consequences of Jean's continual existence. Suddenly the TARDIS grinds to a stop and the console powers down. The room begins to shudder and we see the TARDIS being caught in a beam of light. It flies down the beam tunnel and is pulled down to the surface of Gallifrey. The TARDIS scanner turns on and the Doctor sees that he's back on Gallifrey. He sighs and tells Jean to stay close to him as they exit the TARDIS. There they're greeted by Romana, who takes them to her office, where she explains the situation to them. She says that because Jean has not died, the web of time has begun to crack and continues to splinter off into bigger cracks the longer she stays alive. She turns on a projector which displays everywhere the Doctor and Jean have been this season. However, everywhere appears glitchy, corrupted and broken, as time continues to destroy itself. Romana says that the universe will go on and on destroying itself until there is nothing left. She's sorry, but Jean has to die. After a brief silence, the Doctor asks if there's no other alternative. Romana says that there's not. Well, there's no safe way of having her. She goes on to explain that long ago, in the early days of Gallifrey, Rassilon and one of the other founding fathers, known as the Other, created a machine that could cancel out an individual's existence named Cordis. The machine was used to pause a person's life, but they still live. Their lifespan is essentially paused, but you could still move, live, eat, sleep, and even die like a normal person. However, realizing the dangerous potential of the machine, the Other exiled it to an unbound dimension. A dimension that exists outside of time and space. Romana explains that she can send the Doctor and Jean into this dimension, but only them, as there's only enough time to send one TARDIS through. The Doctor agrees and, after some modifications are made to the TARDIS, a gateway is opened up outside the Citadel. The Doctor and Jean enter the TARDIS before it's grabbed by a robotic claw and flung through the gateway and into the unbound dimension. Inside the dimension, the TARDIS lands on a small dead red world, where they find Cordis. They power the machine on but find the main drive to be damaged, with 3 of the main components missing. However, using Cordis, they're able to track down the missing pieces to 3 separate planets. The 2 then return to the TARDIS, where they travel to this first planet. However, whilst in flight, the Doctor begins to hear a whisper in his head, which laughs at him and says that he should never have entered this dimension. They arrive on the first planet, a modern-esque looking planet named Copper. They track down the Cordis piece to a museum and begin to formulate a plan to steal it. However, before they can put any plan into motion, Jean is arrested on the suspicion of murdering the Emperor of Copper. The story then deviates into a part courtroom, part murder investigation story, with the Doctor trying to prove Jean's innocence and find a true killer. Eventually, the Doctor is able to uncover the real killer, a cyberpunk-esque chip named Che. With Jean cleared of charges, and the Doctor realising that they're taking too long, the pair head back to the museum, where the Doctor smashes open a glass box containing the Cordis piece, before the pair sprint back to the TARDIS and escape. The Doctor then sets the coordinates to the second planet, a planet named Dalt. However, the Doctor becomes more concerned about the voice in his head, as it causes him great pain, which feels as though his head is slowly being crushed. They eventually arrive on Dalt, and find themselves in a relatively small town, which is half alien-esque and half western. However, as the Doctor and Jean begin to search for the Cordis piece, they realise that something is wrong with the townsfolk. They discover that an all-powerful entity, similar to the voice in the Doctor's head, has killed and possessed everyone on the planet, waiting for the day someone would arrive with a way off this world. When the entity discovers the Doctor and Jean, it plans to kill them both and use the TARDIS to escape and conquer other worlds. Eventually, the Doctor is able to reclaim the missing piece, which is disguised as a shield on a concrete statue in the middle of town. However, when the piece is removed, a beam of orange light shines from the eyes of the statue and beams down directly onto everyone on the planet except for the Doctor and Jean. The people cry out in pain before their bodies collapse dead to the ground. Not knowing what else to do and upset by the loss of life, the Doctor and Jean quietly make their way back to the TARDIS. Once again, the Doctor uses the TARDIS to travel to the third and final planet, a seemingly barren world with no name. Yet again, the voice continues to grow and torment the Doctor in his mind. The voice also begins to take over the Doctor's body as he begins twitching rapidly and struggles to gain control over his own voice. The Doctor, terror on his face, asks the voice what it is and what it wants. The voice says that it's nothing and nobody, just a voice without a body, but now it's found a new body, the Doctor. It reveals that their consciousnesses are now intertwined, and its consciousness is evaporating the Doctor's. And once the Doctor's consciousness is gone, all that will be left is the voice, and there's nothing the Doctor can do, saying that the only way to get rid of this voice is to die. The TARDIS then lands on the final planet. Leaving the TARDIS, the Doctor and Jean see nothing but a barren dead landscape and an old grand mansion. Suspecting the piece to be in there, they enter the mansion in search of it. However, as they begin to explore, they find themselves separated from each other. We see the two of them beginning to hallucinate their greatest fears. We see Jean and even the Doctor becoming petrified for their life as they're confronted with some of their greatest fears. We see Jean's fears, a possessed Edith Thompson, the Vatrans, and death itself. However, we never clearly see what the Doctor fears, only the silhouette of a man. Eventually, Jean finds the last Cordis piece, which was disguised as a lump of coal. Once Jean picks up the last piece, she and the Doctor are teleported back to the mansion entrance. The two quickly hug before they're reminded of the current situation when a blood-curdling scream echoes through the mansion. The two quickly make their exit and escape in the TARDIS. With the 3 pieces now acquired, the Doctor pilots the TARDIS back to the planet's house in Cordis. He then proceeds to fix Cordis and reattach the missing pieces. However, as he gets closer to finishing the machine, the voice in the Doctor begins to fully possess him, and the two of them are thrown into a struggle over control. The voice then briefly fully takes over the Doctor and begins to strangle Jean, which knocks her out cold. However, before the voice can cause any more harm, the Doctor's consciousness kicks back in and holds the voice back for the time being. He checks Jean in a state of panic and makes sure that she's still alive. He picks her up in his arms and carries her over to Cordis. He places her down on the machine and prepares to activate it. However, he discovers that Cordis is out of energy, and the Doctor realizes that the only energy Cordis will accept is him. He proceeds to wire himself into Cordis as he plans to burn his body as energy. The voice tries to take over the Doctor and stop him, but the Doctor's willpower is too strong. He takes hold of a big lever and looks at Jean, who begins to reawaken. She cries out to him to stop, but to no avail. The Doctor proceeds to force down the lever and Cordis begins to activate. We see a glow of energy encasing Jean, whilst the Doctor's body begins to spark with electricity. He screams in pain as his body continues to power Cordis. We then hear the voice also screaming, before it leaves the Doctor's body in the form of red smoke from the Doctor's mouth. Eventually, Cordis finishes and Jean is released. Her life is now paused forever and the universe is safe. She dashes over to the Doctor's burnt body and sobs over his remains. To her surprise, he slowly begins to reawaken his eyes. Jean attempts to comfort the Doctor, saying that there must be some way of saving him. The Doctor says he's afraid there isn't, but it's not the end for him. He explains the bare basics of regeneration to her, how he will be reborn in a new body. Suddenly a glow of blue energy begins to emit from the Doctor's hand. Jean sobs and tells the Doctor not to go. The Doctor smiles and says, "I'm sorry, but it's too late for me." He turns to his side, braces himself and states, "Here we go again." Then suddenly the blue energy erupts from the Doctor's face and hands as the regeneration begins. We see the scars melt off the Doctor and his physical appearance is reshaped and regenerated. A few moments later, the regeneration energy dissolves away, leaving the new Doctor lying unconscious on the ground, played by Aidan Gillen. The Doctor's eyes shoot wide open as he pulls himself up and breathes in a lungful of air. He turns to Jean and asks, Did it work?" Jean nods and says she thinks so. Suddenly, the Doctor clutches his chest and feels a sting of pain zap through his body. Jean rushes over to his side and helps him stand. The Doctor says, "Just get me to the TARDIS." We end with Jean slinging the Doctor's arm over her shoulder and helping to carry him back to the TARDIS. Season 36 would have been considered mostly a success and a good end to the Ninth Doctor's era. Whilst the individual stories were mostly praised, some felt that the Web of Time arc could have been explored better. Jean was a well-received companion and many were happy with the news that she would go on to be appearing in a new era. Overall, many felt that Bonneville's tenure went out on a good note. As a whole, Bonneville's era would have been well regarded by casual viewers and fans. Under his wing, the show had proven that it could further adapt into the rapidly evolving TV landscape. For those who grew up in the late 1990s, Bonneville was their Doctor, and his tenure would only grow in appreciation as those fans grew up. And so the Ninth Doctor's tenure came to a close, and the turn of the century was rapidly approaching. Doctor Who had survived the 1990s, a decade that by all rights should have killed the show. But as the dawn of the 21st century began, a whole new production team with a brand new Doctor had a task in front of them. Doctor Who had survived the 1990s. How will it survive the 2000s?